Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we talk about all things Cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Stu, and I am joined by my most wonderful also host,
Anthony.
What's up, Anthony?
Uber Bear.
Hey, Uber Bear.
I'm doing swell. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. So, this is a bit of an UberCube After Dark episode, and I'm recording, I wanted to record this. We just did a recording of just like a regular episode, and we kind of got into it a little bit outside on my deck, which is where all the deep and dark and dirty conversation about magic and a cube and all that kind of stuff happens. And I posed a question to Anthony about power, right? Not power as in power vintage necessarily, but about the evaluation of power and how, in my opinion, the evaluation of the power level of just magic cards in general has changed so much over the last few years. So I'm going to ask a question to Anthony, the same question that I asked him when we were sitting outside. Anthony, tell me the set and the reason why, in the most recent times, and we're probably talking the last 3 years or so, magic has just exploded when it comes to power level. Before you answer that question, right?
Before we go any further down this interesting topic that's going to be wild and crazy, as Stu has promised, he is throwing this at me like a bunch of beanbags right now.
That's
we
right.
do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to have our libations of the show. Stu, what are you having, sir?
So I have a New Belgian Voodoo Vice IPA. I had one of these on the last show, and it's one of my favorite. New Belgium is like my absolute favorite IPA brand.
And I'm having a New Belgian Voodoo Ranger Juicy Haze IPA. Let's go ahead and crack them open and carry forward.
All right, Anthony, what set changed the landscape for the power level of Magic the Gathering in most recent times?
For my cube environment specifically, and I'll do this. The last time I answered this for him, it took about 45 minutes for me to get to a point. But this time, it can be slightly more focused because he kept saying, Anthony.
I did.
Bring it in. I'm like, but. So for me, it was Modern Horizons 2.
Yes.
That was the one that was the earthquake. And it was because when I was looking through it during spoiler season, it's everything in that set had a home that either replaced another card that I had in one of my environments.
Sure.
And I think I can gauge that one most eloquently by the cost that one. I think that's probably the most money that I have spent at one time during a spoiler season that I've ever. I mean, I was just,
pretty expensive.
It was extremely expensive for me.
Pretty expensive.
Keeping up with the Joneses came on pretty high with me at the time. You get that FOMO too. FOMO's very real, and I think I want to pretend that I've gotten past that as a curator, but this is like during the time where, there was an opportunity cost, right? Where a bunch of cards came out during that set. There were also not only new cards that were hot and popping fresh, but there were also a lot of reprints and chase cards, and it allowed them to be replaced in my Powered Vintage environment. Mostly that one was the one that was most impacted. There were definitely some artifact cards that got into my artifact cube that was really neat, and this is all based on recollection, but I'm pretty sure at the time I had 5 cubes, so it hit me. I had to do some some money laundering basically from my savings account to my credit cards.
I don't think you're alone. I honestly don't think you're alone. And to all of you out there, all the cube curators that looked at Modern Horizons and realized, especially in your high power environments, how many cards were like, man, I have to run so many of these cards. You have my sympathies, in the words of Ash, from the greatest Alien movie ever. Just before Anthony starts trying to argue with me.
Oh no, we're gonna. I'm sorry. Well, no, Newt survived this long.
No. Anyway, moving on. So, there was so many chase cards, so many high power cards, so many, as you say, replacement cards, and just incredible power outliers in that set, right?
Correct.
So, what was interesting to me about Modern Horizons is that, not just as a cube enthusiast, but as a magic enthusiast. And I will say that I do generally I'm a consumer of content, right? I like to watch Legacy, Vintage, Cube, Modern, the whole 9 yards, right? Anything that's magic related, I love to watch it, right? So, Andrea Mengucci and Reed Duke and Aspiring Spike and all those guys, right? I love to watch all of their content and all the brews and all the, how they react and adapt to when new sets are released, right? And I did notice there was a massive shift in everything, every format, when some of those new sets were released, right, in the last couple of years, 2-3 years, I would say. And that's going all the way back to vintage, which was almost unheard of for such a long time, that such, in a very condensed period of time, that these eternal 60 card formats had cards banned in them. Like, this is insane. Like, there's no way. Vintage has been around for 30 years. There's no way that we should have cards being released in standard sets that are going to be vintage banned, right? But all of a sudden we see this huge power creep, and now all of a sudden, not just that we have this acceleration in power, because we do, but also it's changed the financial landscape, and that's definitely going to be a factor. And Anthony, I want to ask about that, right? Because you just mentioned about the money laundering, and I know that's a big factor. I'd like you to tell me a little bit about the financial side of things, because we don't really talk about that on the podcast. But tell me about how that impacted you as a cube curator.
Yeah, I'll give numbers. It was $1,000 plus, comfortable
per cube, or just overall.
We're gonna keep it. We're gonna keep it respectful.
Your wife doesn't listen to our podcast.
She may.
So,
she may. But also one thing that I actually observed occurring as well too, because we talked about a lot of cards were usurped. A lot of cards were usurped.
Usurper. Yep.
A lot of cards were usurped. That word. Anyways, it actually drove the financial price point of using my powered vintage environment. I saw it significantly drop in its overall cost value, because a lot of the old cards that are their high ticket items were simply replaced because new cards that were actually more affordable in the grand scheme of things replaced them and kicked them out.
Crazy how
it was
many cards.
Interesting how my cube value went down.
I was going to say,
my wallet got burned.
Yeah, some of those individual cards were
weird.
Crazy expensive, but suddenly there's so many cards that just plummeted in value, especially any card that would have been kind of a legacy. And I will say this.
It
right?
redefined the landscape.
It did. And I will use this as a great example. We have a very good friend of ours. He's never been on the channel. His name's Kevin.
He will be.
He will come on.
He's been dared.
A few years ago, Kevin gifted me, it was my birthday, I believe, he gifted me a foil Snapcaster Mage.
He never gave me a foil Snapcaster Mage.
That's because I'm much cooler than you.
I've known him way longer than you.
I'm much cooler than you.
Maybe that's true.
But at the time, I remember thinking, wow, this might be, and I'm pretty sure it was, at the time, it was the most expensive card that I owned. And it kind of fluctuated a little bit in value, but I think it peaked at right around $180. It was fairly consistently around $165, but I think it peaked about $180. This was for original printing Snapcaster Mage. How much do you think that card is worth today?
I am uncertain.
It's not a lot. It's probably less than $40. I think the last time I looked,
it's got to be more for a foil.
It's like a $40 card.
Even though they reprinted it.
It's like a $40 card.
I need to get rid of mine then and get it updated in UberBear.
It's not worth getting rid of it anymore. You might as well just keep it.
I'm just going to upgrade it because I'll play that. So that card's so versatile.
It's a great card.
I am a commander player too. And then I also have 7 cubes now. Soon to be 8, probably 9.
But even when I think, so this was this was probably 5 or 6 years ago that I got this card. At the time, I remember looking at Snapcaster Mage and evaluating it based on its impact and its viability, not as a cube card. Cube wasn't a thing in my life back then, 5-6 years ago. It's really only become a thing a little bit more recently. Back then, I was more evaluating cards from a legacy, vintage, even modern perspective. But even back then, Snapcaster Mage was a staple. It was a staple in multiple 60 card formats, and it was, and I say it still is a very powerful card, not even close to the power, the level that that it is now, or that exists now because of, again, sets like you say, like Modern Horizons 2. So back then I evaluated the card as a very, very powerful card based on history, based on what it represented as a Magic card. You're looking at me like you're about to tell me some good news or some bad news.
Well, sort of, because as you're talking about Snapcaster Mage, and
what's the full image strap price?
Well, it's power stakes, right? Like what it represented.
Sure.
And it was so unique in its design and build.
It was,
and it made it so powerful. And now this card's, we're not going to say this is an equivalent. But Mom, Marching Machine, just recently reprinted a card that's kind of utilizing all the things that you loved about Snapcaster Mage.
Sure.
But it made it available for the Peasant Cube environment.
Right.
This is an interesting card. Our good friend Sandwich is running this. In his Peasant Cube, it's going to be featured at CubeCon.
Okay.
And the card is going to be Halo Forger. I believe, May's also going to be running this in her Fey Cube, if I'm not mistaken, because it is a Fairy Rogue. And for 1 colorless and Dimir, you get a creature Fairy Rogue flying. When Halo Forger enters the battlefield, you may pay X, not quite the Snapcaster, but When you do, you may cast a target instant or sorcery card with mana value X from a graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that spell will be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. It is a 3/1 flyer. It doesn't have the flash that Snappy has. But what's so interesting is as Wizards of the Coast has continued to uptick the power levels, starting from the floor to the ceiling, and they're basing up, we're getting cards that are starting to touch the realm of the cards that we held so dear and the once was, or the way back.
What an incredible and unique effect Snapcaster Mage once had.
Once was. And it still is. I still believe in it. I still run it.
First of all, it has flash. Right?
Right.
But first of all, you have to have, like, that Halo Forager has no color requirements, right? You just pay 2 generic and you get to cast.
Well, it's got Dimir. It's got Dimir engaged, but it has a cost involved.
It does.
And it doesn't have flash, but it emulates the concept that Snapcaster was doing. That kind of tethers really nicely to what you're talking about.
And it's not even close power level wise, in my opinion. It's not even close. But it's an uncommon that's creeping. Precisely.
That's creeping.
How much is that card, do you think?
Oh, I'll give you
10 cents.
Hold, please.
Is it more than 10 cents? I'd be surprised if it was more than 10 cents.
I didn't really think that far ahead here. We're looking at 14 cents.
Okay, so it's 14 cents.
14 cents for sort of an analogous card.
And Snapcaster Mage was how much back in the day?
Exactly.
It was a lot of money.
But it's wild, right? And granted, we're not trying to put these two in the same spectrum. Don't get me wrong. They're not on the same power level. But it kind of brings some value add to what Stu is saying whenever Wizards of the Coast, aka Hasbro, is pushing these cards so hard that something that, like, if you think about going way back in time, we're H.G. Wells, we're going back in time. Halo Forager would have been a legend, God knows, 15 years ago, right? It would have been just a bonkers card. Now that's just an uncommon card that does a thing that emulates something that we're not. It's the expectations of the players. And that's what we talked about.
Yeah, and this is kind of what I was driving at right from the get-go, was about the evaluation of power level relative to, and I referenced Modern Horizons 2, and the reason why I wanted you, and I knew when I asked this question before we started recording, when we were sitting out on my deck having a glass of scotch, I asked this question because I knew you as a cube curator and as someone that has to kind of keep their eye on new sets, right? Every time there's a new set that's coming out, there's so many people out there that are looking at sets for very different reasons. If you're a modern player, you're looking for, how is this going to shake up modern? If you're a commander player, you're looking at upgrades for your commander decks. If you're a cube curator, primarily, you're looking for cards that can either shake up or provide extra value or just do different things for a cube, right? Make things interesting. So the reason why some of these more recent sets have changed things so significantly is because, and obviously this is a podcast, we're not on YouTube, but like everyone out there that's listening, hold your arm up, right? And then kind of tilt it a little bit, like raise your hand just a little bit higher than your elbow, right?
Horizontally upward?
Yeah, horizontally, like take your left hand, and then tilt your hand just a little bit higher than your elbow, right? And that's kind of been the power,
it's the trajectory,
increase, right? The power trajectory of Magic,
but
and
that goes to infinity if there's any math theorists out here.
But there's been some little blips here or there, right? And I also I made a reference to another very, very powerful card, which was Jace the Mind Sculptor, right? Jace the Mind Sculptor gets released, right? And I will always think about Patrick Chapin. He talked about this back in the day when everyone was there was a bit of a split opinion of it. And he was like, this card is absolutely bonkers. It's going to shake up the whole landscape. Every format is going to want to run this card. It's nuts. And he was absolutely right? That Jace the Mind Sculptor was banned in Modern, was a Legacy and Vintage staple. It's been power crept to oblivion. It's not even a relevant card anymore, right? I don't know. It's not played in really any significance in any format.
I'm going to pause you there because it's important to note everything is relevant in Cube.
Of 100%.
Cube is the one format
and this is
exonerated from.
Agree 100%. Yeah. And this is really, and that statement right there really does tie into what I wanted to talk about with this episode, right? So we're not judging cards based on the power level of a Snapcaster Mage anymore.
No.
We're not judging cards. Even go further back than that. We're not judging cards on the power level.
I think, if anything, the trend is being we're going backwards. If you look at CubeCon and the polls,
are we going backwards because of power level, or are we going backwards because
people are chasing the fun? I think
because we're chasing the fun. Beautiful.
The curators are doing it.
Yes.
That's not to say that Wizards of the Coast is continuing to, they're printing press cards so Mauro talked about this during his drive to work, which I highly recommend. If you haven't listened to it, it's really cool. But one of this was designing cards for an Eternal world. Or I think that's what he called it, Eternal format. Doesn't matter. Sure. You'll get the point. When you look it up, you'll find it. But one thing he talked about is his team has to design. At once, it was just standard, right? That was the format. And then he had to occasionally think about like modern or whatever. And they were all kind of disseminated into their own silos.
I don't know how you do it.
Well, that's what he said in so many words.
I don't even know if it's
painful
possible,
now because Commander's become a hot format. And then we're moving into Cube is starting to become a very noticed high-profile format. I mean, it's getting attention. And then other formats, Pioneer, etc., and there's some other ones. I don't know. I'm forgetting.
Even Oathbreaker is Oathbreaker.
Now, like, they're all getting recognized.
Traction. Yeah.
But every one of these have cards that have value add for different reasons.
Yep.
But their design, when they release a set, they really have to let once was this is designed for a standard system. Now we're moving into, well, how does this card impact Commander? How does this card impact Eternal formats? And then the one thing I want to say is that, again, us as cube curators, we can choose to do our own path. We don't have to prescribe to the rules. The bannings do not matter to us. It is what you choose to do as a cube curator and your play group, feedback, etc. Banning is exclusive to you as the curator and your community.
And what's crazy to me is when I think about, like, not just Modern Horizons, but I think about all of the really, really quote-unquote broken cards, right? I think about Uro. I think about Oko. I think about Ren and Six.
Ragavan.
I think about Ragavan.
You think about Ragavan a lot.
I think about Ragavan a lot. I think about all these cards. A lot of these cards really do shine incredibly well in 60-card formats where you can have 4 of them, where you can build decks that abuse the heck out of them, right? I really do believe that, because I think Ragavan is a very, like, stupid powerful card, right? And it's a very, very good cube card, right? It's a good cube card. It's a great card to get out turn 1. Not a great EDH card, right?
Yeah.
I think you would agree. It's not a great EDH card. I have red decks. I wouldn't run it. I can't think of one red deck where I'd run.
I will find one.
Ragavan, right?
Yeah. Factional Monkey.
Maybe that's just me being stubborn, but anyway.
Yeah.
But they're good cards. They represent a pretty significant power creep in the 60 card formats, right? Not just pretty significant, a huge power creep, right? How has that impacted? And this is kind of a question that I'm gonna put out there, and we like to engage the community. How much has that impacted all of you out there that are not just curators, but also players as well? How much has that impacted your evaluation of cards, right? Because Modern Horizons was, 3 years ago. There's been sets since, and there's definitely been some very, very powerful cards that have been released since then. But also, your cubes out there and all the curators out there, you don't, maybe unless it's specifically a standard rotation cube that you're curating, you've got 20, 30, whatever years of Magic sets that you're putting in your cubes, right? When you look at something like a Jace the Mind Sculptor, and I still look at Jace and think, gosh, darn, that's a powerful card. But then I look at Ragavan and I think, man, people used to look at Jace the Mind Sculptor and think that was broken. Let's even go something, and I love this discussion. I'm going to totally thieve this, right? There was a question that came up recently about the most powerful 1-drop, right? And I'm only going to give you, Anthony, my co-host and close friend, love you to pieces. I'm going to give you 2 choices, rank 1 and 2. Ragavan, Deathrite Shaman.
Interesting, Deathrite Shaman.
You think Deathrite Shaman?
Powerful.
I agree.
Yep.
I agree.
Yep.
I think we're on an island.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are going to choose Ragavan.
We are alone.
And I don't think they're wrong.
I do not.
Because Ragavan is just disgraceful. It's so incredibly powerful. But Ragavan insulated, I think, as strong as it is, I think I look at Deathrite and I kind of hold them up against each other. And I think, man, there's how can anyone not choose Deathrite Shaman? It's like the OG 1 mana that's even hybrid black or green, Planeswalker, you can tap it and accelerate yourself, and then you've got like these 2 other crazy good abilities. Like, how can you not look at that and think it's the most powerful card that's ever been printed at 1 mana?
I run it in my Powered Vintage Cube still because I support
I think
the
you
Lands
should.
Matters, and I like it that it has very incremental hate on the reanimator that can get a little OP, but not too OP, but whatever. And then I'm also having consideration for Deathrite Shaman. Maybe it used to be in there in my horror cube again.
Oh.
It is an elf standing on bones.
Now we're getting to an interesting discussion.
It's stepping
right?
into my thematic cubes a little bit.
So, here we go. So now we're starting into the discussion of, now we've got, again, 3 years or so post Modern Horizons, or whenever you believe, and this is 2023, is sort of the post-COVID incredible power creep of cards, right? In a time where maybe you would have looked at your thematic cube and thought, hang on a second, Deathrite Shaman, there's no way I'm putting this card in my thematic cube. It's stupid powerful. Now you're considering it. Are you considering it because you're evaluating cards differently because of the power creep? Or are you evaluating that card and looking at it relative to other cards that have been printed in the last 2 or 3 years and thinking, hang on, I've put 30, 40 cards in my cube since Modern Horizons or since Dominaria, because in my opinion, Dominaria was kind of the set that was released before the power creep went bananas. And I've put all these other cards in my cubes since that time. And now a card like Deathrite Shaman actually looks quite fair. What do you think?
It is fair, and I would agree with that, but it's also encapsulated within the environment at which it stands. Mm-hmm. Now, yes, you can have ceilings and floors where some cards are extreme power outliers. That is very possible. However, your environment defines the power level of said cards, whether the card likes 100%. It or not.
Yes.
It's kind of like, we talked about this before. Our good friend David mentioned this just recently during a draft. Cards like, we talked about this, like maybe you shouldn't run these cards in certain environments because they're too strong. We'll say Recurring Nightmare, which I'll reference in the show notes. It's very powerful, but
that's kind of low-hanging fruit, though. Recurring Nightmare is like kind of broken.
I'll include it in the show notes, and it still holds its own. It's in my Powered Vintage environment. But if your threats in the environment are so subdued, how much value does a card have? Like, I can agree
with that. If you don't have Gristlebrand or Archon of Cruelty,
you're not getting an Archon of Cruelty or a new Atraxa. You're chasing some other goofy nonsense. What's the 3-drop that you love so much that's in green that you should run in all your green decks?
Leatherback Bailoff.
There you go. And that's what you're going to Recurring Nightmare.
Hey, that's a 4/5 for 3 mana. Right?
Completely devalues the worth of a card. So the environment...
Well, yeah, of course. The ability to be able to reanimate
So Deathrite Shaman really follows that trail too. So it maybe the spectrum of a card that does so much is a little lessened by the environment which it lies. So it's not only that. Another question that I had for you, and I'll kind of come back to it in a minute, when you're talking about Modern Horizons 2 and about the power creep and the valuing and devaluing the cards, I'll come back to this in a minute, was... Who is leading? Is it horse or cart here? Is it us as the populace that's demanding these cards get printed? We want the power creep. Or is it us as the consumers receiving? Or are we receiving the power creep? Your thoughts.
Love this, right? So, and the reason why I love this question is because I think it's an individual question, right? It comes down to either the Magic player, whether you're a 60 card player, if you're a modern enjoyer, cube enjoyer, whatever the case may be. I will certainly say that I remember when the discussion about the power creep was just, everyone was so disgusted with how much power had crept in that short space of time, right? We'd gone from, again, hold your arm up, put your elbow like kind of, an inch or so below your hand, and then it just shot up like crazy, right? And back then, the discussion was, this is just completely unacceptable. There's no way that Wizards can justify the power creep and the acceleration in power that quickly, right? But now the discussion has changed, right? And I say this again as a massive consumer of Magic content, that the discussion is no longer about how disgusted people are generally about the increase in power level. It's about that power level, because that power level that now exists because of cards like Ragavan and Renin 6 and Uro and Oko, etc., pick your, whatever. that is now the normalized power level. So now all the power level discussion, at least at the top end, and certainly I would say, and again, you've got to be so careful with how you define this within the scope of where these cards are at their peak, is there, and I will say, I love watching Modern. These cards are nuts, Modern. Grief, Fury, nuts, absolutely nuts card in Modern. Are they as powerful in a cube environment, right?
Yes.
The reason why,
yes.
Let me tell you, not that I'm disagreeing with you. The reason why I wanted to specifically mention at this juncture Grief and Fury is because Grief is stupid powerful. Fury is stupid powerful, right? The reason why Grief and Fury are very powerful, and Solitude.
There is no and. It's you ordered that differently.
Solitude I put in a different space, and I'll explain why in a second. Yeah. I agree, but the Solitude is in a different
show
space.
Notes. I'll put them in the show notes.
Let me tell you why. Solitude is a wonderful removal spell. Wonderful removal. It's Swords to Plowshares on a stick.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why Grief and Fury occupy a different space, at least in my opinion, is because Grief and Fury have the ability to end games with the right other cards in hand. And I will point out a very, very common, very popular Modern deck right now, which is the Rakdos Scam deck, which involves using a Feign Death effect, whereby on turn 1, you can either evoke and Feign Death a Grief and strip your opponent of 2 cards, or evoke and Feign Death a Fury, do no damage, oh no, but now you have a 4/4 double strike on turn 1.
Yeah,
4/4,
that's pretty gross.
Double strike, turn 1. Solitude doesn't quite have that game-ending ability right off the bat like Fury and Grief do. But Solitude is nuts from a power level perspective.
So I want to take it back a little bit. So Stu's kind of done this benchmark of he's really defining the ceiling, and it's those really,
I am, and I think that's important.
And he's busted through those really ugly spackle ceilings, and he's going to the now modern flat ceilings with the flat paint. And now we're actually, but that's not the only thing that happened. It was a paradigm shift that happened across the entire universe with Modern Horizon 2.
Yes, it was.
I'm going to give you some examples. So it didn't only impact the high vintage environments. So we talked about in Uberbear's Artifact Cube, featured at CubeCon, is one of the things that really increased the dynamicism of that cube environment. Kind of to correlate to what Stu was saying with Modern Horizons 2 and how we talked about it really... He was talking about the ceilings. He went into the high-powered vintage environments. He went into Modern. Correct. He went into some legacy decks. He went into some pretty strong stuff. Me, not only did, whenever they printed Modern Horizons 2, did it really take the ceiling to its max and elevated that altitude that we're expecting for cards as consumers, but it also pushed up, or a bottom got pulled up too. It was a paradigm shift, if you will. So I'm going to give you some examples, and these are things from a thematic cube designer that Modern Horizons 2 truly just redefined the expectations of cards. And it created this dynamics within Uberbear's Artifact Cube that recently got selected for CubeCon 2023. But here's some examples. Arcbound Javelier. For 1 planes, you get an artifact creature soldier. It's an uncommon. Tap, remove X 1/1 counters from Arcbound Javelier. It deals X damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Modular 1.
Can I just ask, what's the rarity on that? What is it?
It was uncommon.
Uncommon.
And it pushed it up to... And so that really gave this real benefit to a modular package, which added this whole new thread. So like my modular was at the time Arcbound Ravenger was the expectation of that, but it didn't have a lot of pieces to it. There's some more pieces that came along as we moved through it.
Arcbound Ravager is like such a huge staple card.
Pushed the envelope that's now entered my Power Cube. This is from Modern Horizons 2.
Okay.
It's borderline egregious, right? Esper Sentinel.
For
1 planes, artifact creature, human soldier. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell, each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. It's a 1/1. I ended up running that in my 2-headed giant cube because it says an opponent. I run that in my artifact cube because it's artifact and has artifact synergies. And it actually entered into my powered vintage cube because, well, it's just powerful at best, right? I mean, this card does a lot. This is what this environment, Modern Horizons 2, really pushed the expectations of what cards do. I'm going to provide you some more examples of how Modern Horizons 2 redefined environments, just really broke the thresholds. I mean, we got from that one, we got Modern Horizons 2 had Archon of Cruelty. I mean, that is one of the premium reanimator targets. For 6 colorless and black, you get a creature Archon flying. When Archon of Cruelty enters the battlefield or attacks target opponent, sacrifice the creature or planeswalker, discards a card, loses 3 life, you draw a card and gain 3 life for a 6/6. I mean, that almost trumped, almost Grizzlebrand in cube environments, which later we've now got Atraxa that's moving in on that.
You think almost the Archon of Cruelty?
It's my favorite.
It's a better card.
Let's go to a common card that's ridiculous. Another example that really this is a common, folks. It's Bone Shards. For 1 black or 1 swamp, you get a sorcery. Common. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature or discard a card. Oh man, we got to discard a card to our reanimator. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. Oh my goodness, this card's insane. We also got some cards like Damn. For 2 swamps, you get a sorcery. Destroy target creature. A creature destroyed this way can't be regenerated. Basically, the equivalent of Wrath of God tethered to a double black pip removal spell.
Wrath of God tied to a 2 mana, 2 black removal spell.
I mean, it just Modern Horizons 2. And then included in all that, as Stu mentioned, we got all the griefs and etc. But this particular set was, I mean, it was the cube opus, right? I mean, it really set the highlights. And then even for we'll say the pauper environment, you got stuff like Tragic Fall. This is a common. For 1 colorless and 1 swamp, you get an instant. Target creature gets -3/-3 until the end of the turn. And then you get Hellbent. That creature gets -13/-13 until the end of the turn if you have no cards in hand. That's not an associated cost. You're just playing Magic. You're not emptying your hand. But this is what we got now. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on. This environment, on top of the modular creatures, we got Arcbound Slasher, Arcbound Tracker, Arcbound Whelp. It just filled out my Artifact Cube environment with all these modular effects that do some powerful, nutty stuff. This set was crazy.
And something that we talked about, right? All right, this is the last specific one. Actually, it's not, but we'll talk about one more. This is Darcy, Dragon's Rage Channeler. 1 red, creature human shaman, 1/1. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, surveil 1, and it has Delirium, as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. DRC gets +2/+2, has flying, and attacks each combat turn if able. Delver much? Is it better? ? I don't know. Here's where, one of the things that sort of inspired me to talk about this today, right? It was about power level evaluation, right? Because I think that the power level evaluation has been just shifted so dramatically over the past few years with these recent sets, right? And just how crazy strong some of these cards are. So, and Anthony already knows the answer to this question. And we've talked about this cube a little bit during this episode, as we have in other episodes, which is Artifact Cube. Anthony's Artifact Cube was featured at CubeCon last year. Yeah. And is going to be featured again at CubeCon 2023. And Anthony was like, look, I'm so proud of this cube. And it's been cloned a bunch of times, right? Yep. Awesome. Other people are looking at this cube like, man, this is a super awesome cube. People love artifacts. And I love the fact that people are looking at this cube and want to, emulate it, want to play a version of it. There was a couple of copies or a couple of cards, I will say, and I will say both of them I had a bit of an opinion of. One of them in particular, I will say that I had an opinion of, but other players, and not just myself as a, sort of part-time podcaster / occasional cube drafter. We're talking pro Magic players, and I'm serious about this. Pro Magic players that had opinions about Anthony's Artifact Cube, right? And there was a particular card that we had generally, as the people that had drafted this cube, had looked at and was like, this is pretty egregious, and decided to remove from the cube. And then this cube gets cloned a bunch of times, and it ends up getting put right back in there.
Kappa
right?
Cannoneer or Trigon Predator?
It's Kappa Cannoneer.
Both of them got
ladies and
shoved
gentlemen.
back in.
I will say. So there's a couple of things that I think about when I think about these two cards, right? Trigon Predator and Kappa Cannoneer. Trigon Predator represents an amount of repeatable value that I always think is difficult for me to accept in a cube, which is so heavily themed in a direction where something just has the ability to be so impactful, right? Incredibly impactful. So Trigon Predator is one colorless, Simic, and it's a 2/3 flyer. Whenever it connects, you get to blow up an artifact that OP controls, right? That's in an artifact-themed deck. You can see how that would be pretty powerful, right? Kappa Cannoneer has an ability. It's a newer ability, and it's Ward, but it's not Ward 1.
Ward 4.
It's not Ward 2. It's Ward 4. So... And I'll go all the way back. You remember a discussion we had with Justin Parnell, JP, love you, baby, about Koth of the Hammer. Koth of the Hammer, incredible card, and it is a Planeswalker for 2 red, 2 colorless, which JP said is basically what? It's not 2 red, 2 colorless. It's 4 red.
I said
because
that.
4 red is what basically you're playing in that deck.
I called it out.
So in Kappa Cannoneer, it's not that it has Ward 4. What does it really have?
Ward 5?
No.
4+1?
Another keyword.
Hexproof.
Hexproof.
There we go.
That's exactly what it has.
I knew I'd get it eventually, folks.
You didn't get it eventually. You got
Math.
it immediately. Right? That is essentially what it has. And I will ask this. Anthony, in your artifact cube, and I would put, say, green is pretty representative, highly representative of hexproof. How much other hexproof do you have?
No longer.
Well, it's not. It's a blue card.
It's all
right?
gone.
So it's all gone. Why?
I cut it all because it was an interactive.
It's not an interactive keyword,
and the cards were pushing that. Even though the ward was getting pretty maximized, I decided to pull it back. So I don't really want to represent cards in any of my environments outside of my Powered Vintage environment that cannot be interacted with. I recently cut Lightning Greaves, for example, from Uberbear's Artifact Cube out of the concerns that people could make just this juggernaut with equipment stacked on it, and then the last equipment you put on it is Lightning Greaves, and then going for an attack that no one could deal with. It's just something I had to be mindful for as a curator, and that's because the power creep has gotten real in recent years.
Exactly.
But I want to reiterate though, as a curator, power creep only means to you what you want it to mean. You are the person who can manage and choose what's allowed to inject itself or permeate within said environment.
You're not wrong.
You
are not wrong.
Yeah, the opportunity cost has to be weighed. You have to decide whether or not FOMO is real. And when a new set comes out and you get new reveals and you see we talked about in a recent episode with Bloodforged Battle Axe and about it maybe not cutting the mustard because of the resources and equity and the efficiency of the card. However, part of the thing that we do as curators, we decide what actually fits in the environment, which makes the most sense.
And what is the expectation?
I really want to focus on fun.
And what is the expectation? Because let's all the way go back to yesteryear, where we talked about a very, very iconic card. And I actually talked about this. I talked about this on the socials, right? I brought it up on Reddit. I brought it up on Twitter. But I talked about Tarmogoyf, right? And it's a card that I've brought up with you on a few occasions. Why do people want to see it? Do people expect to see it? Is it a card that is in let's just say, a vintage environment because it is a card that is expected to be present because it has been at some point in its Magic lifetime so iconic and so very powerful? And you said verbatim pretty much that you included it in your vintage cube and your powered cube because your players expect to see that card.
They did, and I was caving into that. Now, I want to redact some of my responses on Tarmogoyf. Tarmogoyf has a home in a graveyard synergy cube, something that can really take advantage of its powers and its strengths. I even considered it for Uberbear's Horror Cube at one point because I'm doing a self-mill type package.
Sure.
It has value add. It just didn't something that I wanted to add in that environment. But it's interesting to see a card kind of fall from grace in the terms of
Do you think it has? Do you think it has fallen from grace?
No, it's fallen from one type of cube to another type of cube, and that's what's so interesting about cube.
Okay.
I do this a lot of times. So, like when a card actually I remove a card, and we talked about this in our Walk the Plank episode with Justin Parnell.
Yep.
That definitely got some heated debate going on about it. But what's interesting about that is whenever I removed a card, and I'll say it again, just because it left one cube doesn't mean it didn't go into another, and it certainly did. So as I cut cards from my Powered Vintage Cube, from something like Modern Horizons that caused me to do this drastic amount of remove and replace, I then move them to another environment.
Yep.
So Tarmogoyf thrives in a graveyard synergy environment. It thrives because it's at home in that environment.
Let me pose another, conundrum to you, as I like to do.
Sure.
Right? Do you remember a while ago we talked about a particular counter spell? And I talk about this in a number. I've talked about this in other episodes, but it was one that we focused on as being a counter spell that scales depending on the power of the environment. Do you remember what that was? In my opinion, it's maybe the most iconic counter spell of all time.
Mystic Confluence?
No, another one, even more like vintage power level, playable.
Scale?
No, yeah.
No, you gotta
all I have to do is pay a life and like
force mayhem,
forcing
me to answer.
Force of.
I don't have any will to answer this.
Force of will, yes, exactly. So we talked about force of will, and we talked about Force of Will as a spell that is, Force of Will, don't get me wrong, it's absolutely bananas power level wise, right? But we talked about it in the way that even though on the surface it's like completely absurdly powerful, it almost has the ability, or maybe does have the ability, to scale with the power of the cube, because you do have that added cost, and because it's always about the quality and density of the cards that you can counter, right?
Correct.
Do you think that maybe Tarmogoyf exists in a similar space to something like Force of Will, where it scales with the power level of the cube, right? Because you think about Tarmogoyf has a very specific set of conditions for how it can become either good, very powerful, or completely broken, right? Do you think that maybe Tarmogoyf exists in a similar kind of space to something like Force of Will, where the environment it exists in really does, it's so dependent as a card on the archetypes and the play experience of the cube, as we're talking about it as a cube podcast, of the cube that it's in?
So Tarmogoyf is very reliant on what you pitch to the yard, right? So fetches really drive the power of Tarmogoyf out the gate.
Right. So so you can imagine
the starting point.
Yeah. So no fetches. Right.
So you've now stepped it down one notch, right?
Immediately.
And then if you don't have any kind of self-mill or discard outlets to put stuff in the yard to give it value, so it's
no
not...
no thought seeds, Inquisition.
The answer to the question is Tarmogoyf, again, reiterating, definitely graveyard-centric cubes or any kind of self-mill type of environments or anything like that, or the ability to discard. But outside of that, if you take it out of that, it's trapped in an aquarium. It requires conditions to be met.
And I would argue that
where we talked about Force of Will is scalable. People may not agree with that, but Force of Will is very packaged and vacuum dependent because it can scale. I run Force of Will in a large majority of my thematic cubes.
How many cubes do you play where the density of or just having cards in your hand and making sure you get value of the cards in your hand are so critical? Right, because a card like Force of Will, where you have to pitch, is not nothing.
A blue card. It
is a blue card.
That's all it requires.
But it's
that's all it requires. Whereas Tarmogoyf kind of falls underneath that guy's a little bit of delirium, where it requires key piece setup to get the most value add out of it. So it thrives in a powered vintage environment because the pieces are there.
But it can grow.
And
it can grow pretty quickly.
But it has, so it comes down to slot equity. If you have the space in your powered vintage environment, rock on with your bad Tarmogoyf. There's nothing wrong with the card. Perfectly serviceable card. I have a 540 and I just wanted to test stuff back to what we said, and I kind of want to move into closing. Modern Horizon 2 kind of set the bar so high on the power creep level of what cards and what we tie in and how we're going to remove and replace them, that cards like this, they're going to have to, I pack them up and move them to another section.
Yes.
But they have a home.
They do. And
sometimes it's in my binder for 3 or 4 days, but it will find a cube after I build a new one.
And I love the fact that you understood that we were tying that back in, right? Because there was a time where Tarmogoyf was just such a poster child for like a very, very powerful card, right? And now it is a bit of an afterthought, right? Yes, I would say it has, in a lot of people's minds, been kind of pushed out of vintage power cube level. I don't know how much I agree with that. I think you could make arguments that if you don't support Storm, maybe you could make an argument that it should be back in there. But either way, it's crazy how we're now evaluating these cards so differently. And it feels like it's been in the last couple of years that now we have these super duper powerful, your Ren and Sixes, your Uros, your Okos, your Griefs, your Solitudes, your Furies, right? And how much this has changed the landscape for how we evaluate cards, right? And certainly, again, you as a curator and me as a drafter, I look at how I evaluate cards, and I will say I evaluate cards differently because of how power creep has happened. And I look at... I will say I will look at a list, and if it has a density, any kind of density of those cards, those post Modern Horizons 2 cards, who knows? Like, I'm looking for those cards. Like, why wouldn't you? They're super duper powerful, right? Love Tarmogoyf. But maybe
it's just we're tying off all these ideas. So interesting fact about Cube is Cube has no rules, no regulations, no committee, no bans. It is amazing. You put it anywhere. You just go ahead and say, I like this card.
Yep.
I want to rock it. That's what you do.
That's what you do.
And it will thrive in every environment that you put it in there.
And this is why Cube is the best format.
It is by
This
far.
is why Cube is
the superior format.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. This was kind of an off the cuff episode. I love that we've got to talk about power level because it is something that I think is worth a lot of discussion. I don't think this is the last time we're going to talk about it. I think in the next, so many episodes, there's going to be more power creep and we'll talk about it again. But either way, this was wonderful. Let's start wrapping it up again. To all of our listeners, thank you so much for hanging out with us. This is going to be we've done 50 or something episodes right now. Thank you all for coming and hanging out with us. It's been a great time. Come hang out with us and chat with us on Twitter. You can find us at UberCubeMTGPod. If you want to email us, maybe you got a bit of a discussion you want to get started, find us at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. We would love for you to go check out our Alter Sleeves affiliate link, www.altersleeves.com/UberCube. Get 5% off of your purchase. And if you go check out our Twitter, we also have our Inked Gaming affiliate link. If you want to go check out some playmats, dice bags, mouse pads, all kinds of custom bling for your EDH decks, your cubes, whatever the case may be, go check it out. Really awesome products that they've got over there. Anthony, would you like to talk to us about the Patreon?
No.
And as always, come check us out and have a chat with us on Discord, man. We got all kinds of cool conversation. Come check out, and I've mentioned this previously, I really want to see the deck bling. I want to see the deck bragging. I want to see you guys this is a deck that I drafted online, or a deck I drafted at a LGS or sitting around my kitchen table. I really love this ability for anyone who's cubing to show off the decks, man. We want to see what you're drafting.
Or if you're really new to Cube, like I'm in another Facebook. It's MTG Cube Drafting, and we've got people there who go, "Hey, I want to build my first cube," or "Hey, my child wants to play cube with me," etc. And I'm like, "Hey, here's some resources." And I always reference them to Cube 101 by John Terrell, Cultic Cube, which is the bee's knees. But then I'm like, I got to do a little like, here's UberCube. This is okay too. But then I say, just come to the Discord. We can chat about it. And I reference all it. So it's just a good learning opportunity. We have a lot of curators with a lot of different experience levels. That's what we're trying to really, harness/harvest from our group, is that we're bringing in, I think Stu mentioned this, if not in this episode, in a previous episode, UberCube is not Stu and I. It is the community.
This is why
we want to bring knowledge to the forefront.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's experiences.
I love recording this podcast, but I also know that we've had our wonderful friend of the channel, Chris Moore, aka Sandwich, who is just a pauper, just god,
and
right?
peasant
god. He's the person that should be coming on here and telling you all about about those environments,
so
right?
We're trying to harness the expertise of what people do. Like everybody's got their. So, man, are your thematic people? I've got Powered Vintage. We're just reaching. We're trying to really reach into a lot of aspects.
I'm the meta
of
guy.
Cube, and he's the meta.
I'm
person.
the meta guy.
All right, so that pretty much concludes this episode. I appreciate everybody listening. This has been a blast. Stu's just tossing those, like May likes to say, curveballs at me, and I'm like, sure, I'll field it, whatever.
You handled it.
Most people don't know about me. I was a baseball player and a pitcher, believe it or not, for my stature.
Ooh.
I could throw a mean-ass fastball. But let's say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is, Happy cubing!